With no end in sight to the demonstrations that seemed to turn violent almost nightly, we finally got a chance to talk to some officers on the ground.
It does take kind of a psychological toll to sit there and listen to this hate, for no other reason other than the fact that we're police officers.
Plus, a deeper look at how systemic racism impacts every part of our world.
It's not my blackness that's the problem. It's the impacts of the system that interacts with me because of my blackness.
And how we can change things for the better.
We have to understand that it is all of our responsibility to do this work.
Here's the story. Hey everybody. Let's start things off a little bit differently tonight. After all, you probably know this. People tried to set a government building on fire again last night with people inside. And that should disturb you. And if you're disturbed by that, which you should be, I think you should say something about it. Bring it up to your spouse or your friends or your coworkers. And if somebody tries to minimize what you're saying, calling it just a garbage fire or saying that a brick building could never be engulfed by something like that, you should be offended or triggered or whatever the word is. And you should have a conversation with them about that. Many nights right here on this show, we focus on the clashes between protesters and officers. We've questioned the tactics of police and the feds, the tear gas and the rubber bullets, the allegations of targeting journalists. We question them a lot because, and I've explained this before, because they're part of us, an extension of us. We pay their salaries with our tax dollars. They reflect our values as a society. We don't really cover the protesters the same way because they're not the same. We do listen to their motives. We do some interviews with them to try and hear their message. We try to find a theme among thousands of voices and report on acts of violence when we see them. Many viewers, I think, misconstrue our varying focus on those topics as a bias. But when I report a story, people ask me about this. They think I have an interesting job, and I always tell them the same thing all the time. It's really not as complicated as it seems. You just say what you see. And tonight, I'm asking you to think like a reporter. What do you see in this video from last night? I'm not asking what you think about police. I'm not asking if you think Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. I'm not asking about systemic racism or white privilege. I'm asking what you see right here. I see arson. I see people smashing windows and trying to set a building on fire. You can support the protest. You can support black lives and police reform. You could want to abolish police. You want to abolish the police department? Support that. Believe in that. Speak for that. But if you support what these violent people are doing almost every night now, you are wrong. There have been a lot of conversations in this country about the consequences of being quiet when you see something that's wrong, from the White House to our dinner tables. And if you're being quiet on this, I'd love to hear why. Reach out to us tonight on email at thestory@kgw.com. Find me on Facebook and Instagram, or use Twitter and the hashtag HeyDan. I'm Dan Haggerty. Thanks for being with us tonight. Let's get started with the show. And you can probably guess the big story tonight. Our city leaders are not being quiet. They want the violence to stop. People have already gotten hurt. They think someone could get killed.
I'm compelled to address what happened just last night in our community, what we expect to happen over the next few nights, and the consequences. Last night, 200 to 300 people went to East Precinct intent on violence. The purpose was to attack the East Precinct facility and the people therein. When I say violence, I'm not talking about vandalism. I mean specifically the intent to commit violence against people. The attack was immediate, it was intentional, and it was planned. It was intended to cause serious injury or death, and it very well could have. I believe that city staff could have died last night. I cannot and I will not tolerate that. This is not peaceful protest. This is not advocacy. I don't believe that Portlanders want to see public buildings burned or city employees murdered.
Mayor Wheeler says they're expecting other planned attacks on occupied city buildings this week and this weekend. He said that he understands the original intent of the protest. I think that we all do, right? The Black Lives Matter movement. He also emphasized that we started to see changes to address things like police brutality. But as Portland Fire Lieutenant Damon Simmons put it, this is not the way to go.
I am 100% for the movement. I'm 100% for making things better for us as minorities, and making this city a better place. But this is not the way to get there. And hurting people and trying to trap people in buildings and burn them up it's just completely awful. And so
now, since this whole thing started months ago, we've been waiting and wanting to talk to police. And I don't mean through a spokesperson or through hearing from the chief during a press conference. I mean actually sitting down and speaking to officers who are on the ground night after night dealing with all of this chaos. Today, we finally got the opportunity to hear from some of them. Look, it wasn't ideal if you ask me. It was done on Zoom. Most of the conversation was still being steered by the police spokesperson. Reporters could ask a question, but it certainly wasn't a conversation, and I'm still waiting for one of those. But it was definitely interesting to hear from them. And some of what they told us was graphic and disturbing.
While we were standing on line for hours, our officers were subject to some of the most horrific displays of hate that I've ever seen in my life. In particular, I had 2 female officers on my squad, and the crowd seemed to really key in on them, along with the women that were on RRT. And they were just saying some of the most vile things to them, talking about sexually assaulting them, talking about how they were, sex objects for all the other officers, on the squad, and even going as far as to say that there was one individual who said that he was going to take the baton from one of the female officers and sexually abuse her with it.
People see me at work in uniform and assume X, Y, Z about me. They assume they know what my values are. They think they know what my experiences in life have been, that I've lived a life of privilege, and because my skin looks white, that I have had a certain upbringing, or automatically think that I can't understand, where they're coming from and how they grow up. And probably why I purposely waited until now to say it, but it's important, is I am half black and half white. And the sad part is that I'm even having to say that, because I think we have gotten so lost in the division of police versus black, or black versus white, or white versus minority, that it is just creating more division. We're not getting anywhere.
Now, let's pivot for just a second from the protests, but stick with police for just a moment here, because there's something else going on in Portland that they're really concerned about, and I think we all should be, and that's gun violence. It is way, way up. July was the deadliest month in 30 years in the city. 99 shootings just last month. So even though that we're focusing a lot on the protests, this is also a huge and very important story. Throughout the show, we're going to be hearing from some of the community members who have been impacted by gun violence and who are demanding our leaders do something to stop it. Okay, we've heard from Portland Police. We want to check in now on federal officers. Acting DHS Secretary Chad Wolf testified before Congress today, and Portland is still a very huge topic. First off, he says federal agents are still in Portland, protecting the courthouse, even though a lot of people think they left town. He also blamed local authorities for not assisting them, not assisting the feds, saying they didn't allow Portland police to patrol parks near the courthouse or make any arrests for violence directed at federal officers. Wolf says other cities around the country have cooperated with them.
Unfortunately, for 60 days in Portland, we did not see that occur. No one was holding these individuals accountable. Night after night, they would do their violent acts. No one would hold them accountable. The DHS was put into a position that we had to start making arrests. We had to hold these individuals accountable.
He also once again talked about something that we spent a lot of time on last night: eye injuries. Officers, or officials rather, had said that 3 federal officers were likely permanently blinded by lasers, but we confirmed that they actually made a full recovery last night, or at least that's what we thought.
This is not the laser that your cat or your dog may chase on the ground. This is a very, very powerful laser. So it hits their eyes. It will heat up the nucleus of the eye and will give you permanent damage. We've been able to address that with some eye protection, but we have 3 officers that will likely lose some portion of their vision.
Okay, you heard him there use that word likely again, likely lose a portion of their vision. But again, earlier this week, Wolf's own deputy contradicted that before Congress, something that we reported on last night.
We've had a number of officers who had days-long blindness. So far, they've all kind of come back, if you will.
Okay, so as we stand right now, we're still not certain what's true and what isn't. Hopefully everybody's vision has come back, right? That's what we're hoping. Wolf says that we're not just talking about eye injuries, though. Federal officers have been injured, a lot of them at the protests, in other ways. 277 injuries, they say, in all. It's a hard thing for a lot of people to come to terms with, but we're all part of a big problem.
This is the racism that has been normalized within all the systems in which we engage in.
So what can we do to work against systemic racism? When the story continues.
There was two people in the car with my son, Brian and Terrence. They won't even come forward and speak. How do you live with yourself? How do we live with ourselves as a community? Everybody in Portland know who killed my son. I was told right after he did it, he said I made a mistake. He was a good guy. But nobody comes forward. If we don't, and I told you guys this 9 years ago, don't let it be your son, because I never thought it would happen to me. I had a young person that I love, maybe 40s, because when you get my age, everybody young. She said, I know who killed my brother in the streets, but the code won't let me tell. I'm gonna let the police do the work. So when we talk about unpacking, let's unpack and reimagine that. Because I know a prominent gang member who's changed his life around. He's a accredited OG, and my nephew knows him well. He said, when I was out there shooting, I was shooting and killing myself. That's internalized oppression.
Welcome back. Throughout the show, we're going to continue to listen to these really emotional pleas from community members, some who have lost children to gun violence in Portland. Like I said before, earlier, that July was the deadliest month we've seen in the city in 30 years, and they want to see the shootings end. Unfortunately, Portland's black community is disproportionately affected by this violence. Here's another problem impacting black people and other people of color: systemic racism. It's a term I know you've been hearing a ton about over the past couple of months, but not everyone knows what it means, what it really means, or how we all fit into the problem. Here's Brittany Folkers.
The death of George Floyd has forced many white Americans to reflect on what racism looks like in our country. It's not easy. Most of us have been taught about racism through a narrow lens, but it's just not that simple. Racism takes many forms, and before we can be part of the solution, we have to understand the problem. CEO of Portland Center for Equity and Inclusion, Hanif Fazal, and CEO of North Star Forward Consulting, Lillian Green, have dedicated their careers to empowering the community with an understanding of racism to create a more equitable future. Green says it's important to recognize that racism isn't one size fits all. In her workshops, she breaks down racism into 4 dimensions: internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic.
First thing that you have to understand is the fact that, like, you have normalized racism already in your practice, the way in which you were educated, the way in which you were taught to do your job, the way in which we engage with each other on the street. And when we think about being anti-racist, and then think about anti-racism on those 4 different dimensions of racism, we have to understand that it is all of our responsibility to do this work.
There's internalized racism, our own thoughts, feelings, and actions, conscious and unconscious, as an individual. This racism exists in things like a belief in negative racial stereotypes, denying services to someone based on the color of their skin, or denying racism even exists. Then there's interpersonal racism, acts of racism between one person and another. Fazal says this is how we're taught to see racism, how one person is treating another: harassment, discrimination from a boss, a racist rant caught on a cell phone video.
And so I kind of grew up with this idea of racism being the exception to the rule. That the general rule was that we live in this equally based society. If racism happens, it's bad individuals
that are doing something that's contrary to the norm. And so I think if we can start there with like, hey, how have we been taught to think about or understand race or racism?
There's institutional racism. Some use this term interchangeably with systemic racism, but Green makes a distinction. She says institutional racism is connected to the policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workplace or organization. This can be seen in discriminatory hiring practices, silencing of black voices in the boardroom, or a work culture that prioritizes a white point of view. And that brings us to our main focus, systemic racism. This is how the other three dimensions are allowed to thrive in our society, both openly and in the shadows.
When you get to systemic racism, you think about this is the racism that has been normalized within all the systems in which we engage in.
And when I think about systemic racism, I think about policies, I think about practices, I think about a culture that supports that racial arrangement.
Systemic racism involves all our institutions: education, healthcare, housing, government, and more, collectively upholding racist policies. It's the ripple effect from hundreds of years of racist and discriminatory practices that plays out today. To see the impact of systemic racism, Green says just look at the statistics.
So when we think about this racialized predictability, it's really important to think about the magnification of our likelihood of being placed into, like prisons, being placed in restrictive environments and dying based off our, our racial identity, our ethnic identity, and all these other markers that comprises of our identity.
African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. And according to the NAACP, although African Americans and Hispanics make up about 32% of the U.S. population, they made up 56% of all incarcerated people in 2015. As for health care, in 2017, 10.6% of African Americans were uninsured, compared with 5.9% of non-Hispanic whites. In 2018, 8.7% of African American adults received mental health services, compared with 18.6% of non-Hispanic white adults.
As a Black woman, as I'm entering into these spaces, it's not my Blackness that's the problem. It's the system, the impacts of the system that interacts with me because of my Blackness.
Green says if we're able to predict the life expectancy of people based on someone's race, zip code, and neighborhood, we have to understand that multiple systems of oppression are in play to make it a reality. Many white people don't see systemic racism because they're simply not looking. He argues if your race has benefited and continues to, it's difficult to challenge that notion.
And so I think sometimes there is both comfort level and a privilege, but to not look, right? Not have to look, where people of color are forced to deal with that stratification every single day, forced to deal with that in every interaction that they have. White folks have the privilege of not having to do that.
Green has a different take on it. She says the evidence of systemic racism is all around us.
It has been heard and it has been pushed to the side. It has been, refuted. It has been denied credibility.
And she says that's perpetuated by our understanding of history and progress for people of color.
There's a perpetuation of a sanitized history that we have to interrupt, that even though these conversations have been clearly being had over generations, over centuries, we have, as a society, we have felt comfortable with ignoring what's been in front of us.
But if we take the time to educate ourselves, recognize our implicit bias, and open our eyes to how we got here, that's when you can fully work towards change and equality.
We can begin to think about, okay, how do I build relationships with those communities so they can help inform what our spaces need in order for them to really thrive?
If you want to learn more, you can find more information on our website, kgw.com. Now we want to take a second and go into the KGW Vault, a look back to a pretty dark time in world history. Today's the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima in World War II. An estimated 140,000 people were killed. That was 40% of the city's population at the time. When you factor in the death toll from people who got cancer from the radiation, it's about 300,000. You can see in these photos the destruction on the ground was immense. A huge part of the city was flattened. 3 days later, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, which killed tens of thousands of more people. Japan surrendered, ending World War II. Whew, all right, heavy show tonight, but look, it's a heavy time, and it deserves this type of attention. We need to talk about these things. But after the commercial, we're going to lighten up a little bit, read some comments, and finish the story after this.
And so what we're saying today is that not only do we want the violence to stop, and we might as well say it, we've got to do something. We want the violence to stop, but we want to re-envision and reimagine what it means for us as a community to work together. It can happen, and I pray it starts today with this team and you that are here today. Thank you.
Now, let's get to some hard news that gets soggy in milk. I know there's a lot going on in the world, but can we talk about the cereal aisle for just a minute? I took these pictures in Safeway the other day. Twinkies cereal, churros cereal. What are we talking about? Frosted Flakes with marshmallows? That's not even creative. You know you had a marshmallow surplus and you just started dropping them in. Admit it. Anyway, I'm not alone in this fight here. We had some fun on my Facebook page, where I also learned from a viewer that there's such thing as Sour Patch Kids cereal, which shouldn't be a thing. I think we can all agree upon that. Is this a selfless plug for you to follow me on Facebook? Yes. Did someone get me to order a weird cereal from Australia for $15 on Amazon that arrived today? Yes. Facebook gets fun. You can find me at Dan Haggerty, KGW. Now, I want to take a quick moment and recognize someone who might perhaps be our youngest fan. We have some young fans, but Jennifer tweeted, "Hey Dan, any chance for a shout out to my 11-year-old son Henry, who's watching now and never misses. He always loves your theme music." Henry, if you are a regular viewer, you clearly are smart, because you know that any compliment, hey Laurel, how about that? Little Laurel Porter sighting walking through there. Henry complimented the music. That's a straight way to my heart. Thank you. So to everyone who hates the music and emails me about it every night, just think of Henry, okay? By the way, Henry, great name. Almost named one of my sons Henry. It's a strong name. I like it. Thank you for tuning in, and I'm glad we got that Laurel Porter showing there. Want to read a quick email. All right, this one came in from Donna. It's kind of long. Bear with me. I've been a watcher of KGW since moving to Portland from Denver 7 years ago. Tonight is the last time I will watch your newscast. You've lost me, and I don't believe you represent what's special about Portland, the reason why I moved here. After showing a clip of the East Precinct fire, you said that I was wrong if I didn't see arson. What I see is a white man telling people like me that their opinion is wrong, and that's wrong. I see a building that represents and protects systemic racism in this country. I see a place that is meant to protect people, yet still today houses racist police and policies. I see people putting property over people, and that's wrong. She goes on. Aside from obviously me disagreeing entirely with your opinion of what is a crime and isn't a crime in that video and what we were witnessing, let's talk about everything else that you believe, which is entirely fine, and the goal to fix that. Take a look at how people are responding. When the feds moved in here, whether you agreed with that or not, the community pushed back and they left because it wasn't working. That move only brought in more protests and more violence. Regardless of the tactic early on, it didn't work. Looking at what these people are doing now, the violence that they are committing, the response from the community, is that the way to accomplish the goals that you set out in these emails? Read the room. That's it for tonight. Thanks for being with us. That's the story. I'll see you back here on Friday.